He had survived 17 assassination attempts. He had negotiated peace treaties between families who drew blood the way other men drew breath. He had never, in 41 years of iron-fisted existence, made a mistake this absurd. Until tonight. The streets of New York were slick with November rain, and Damian Voss, head of the Voss Syndicate, architect of 3 boroughs' underground empire, a man whose name made senators go quiet and judges look away, was bleeding from a gash above his ribs, dizzy for what he suspected was a mild concussion, and he had somehow, in the chaos after the ambush on Fifth Avenue, climbed into the wrong car. He realized at the moment the vehicle moved. The seat was wrong. Fabric, not leather. There was a pine tree air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, and the radio was playing a late-night gospel station at low volume. His men drove blacked-out SUVs with heated seats and tinted everything. This was a 10-year-old Honda Civic that smelled faintly of coffee and vanilla. He tried to speak. The darkness came for him faster. 23 blocks away, and completely unaware that her back seat had just become a crime scene, Delilah Marsh was finishing the last of a 12-hour shift at Rosewood Diner in Manhattan's Lower West Side. She was 27 years old, sharp-eyed, and tired in the specific way that only comes from months of waking up before the sun and coming home after midnight. She untied her apron, pocketed $14 in tips, a slow Tuesday, and headed for the exit before her manager could ask her to cover one more table. Her car was parked 2 blocks over on a side street she'd been using since the parking garage raised its rates in September. She walked fast, head down against the rain, keys already in hand, because New York at midnight was no place to be slow. She unlocked the Civic, dropped into the driver's seat, and pulled the door shut. Then she heard breathing. Not hers. Delilah froze. The kind of freeze that comes not from fear, but from the sudden, primal calculation of danger. Slowly, she looked in the rearview mirror. A man was in her back seat. Big, dark coat, eyes closed, head tipped against the window. And even in the dim orange glow of the streetlight, she could see the dark stains spreading across the left side of his shirt. Blood. What in the... She spun around, and her first instinct, sensible, hard one, was to get out of the car and scream for anyone within earshot. But her second instinct caught her. He wasn't moving. His breathing was shallow and uneven, and the blood was spreading. He was dying. Delilah Marsh had grown up in Washington, D.C.'s toughest public housing. She had watched men get shot. She had watched people walk past them. She had sworn at 15 years old that she would never be the person who walked past. She gripped the steering wheel. "Don't die in my car," she said, mostly to herself. Then she put the Civic in drive. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know what she'd driven herself into. But she drove toward the nearest urgent care clinic with the same expression she wore when the kitchen was slammed and the orders were backing up and there was nothing to do but move. If she had known who was bleeding in her back seat, she might have made a different choice. But Delilah had never had the luxury of knowing things in advance. She had only ever had the choice of what to do right now. And right now, a man was dying. So she drove. She drove fast. And the rain came down like the city was trying to wash something clean. It wasn't until the urgent care door slid open and the nurse took one look at the unconscious man she was half dragging through the entrance and said, "Ma'am, is that a gunshot wound?" that Delilah Marsh understood that her quiet Tuesday night had just ended. What came next? She wasn't ready for any of it. If you've ever had a stranger walk into your life and change everything without asking permission, keep watching. You're going to want to hear what happened next. Damian Voss came back to consciousness the way a man does when he's been trained never to show weakness. All at once, eyes open, every sense instantly cataloging his surroundings before a single muscle moved. Ceiling. Low. Textured white paint with a small water stain in the corner shaped like a bird in flight. A single window with thin curtains the color of old cream, filtering in gray morning light. The sound of a city waking up, distant traffic, a dog somewhere, the metallic clatter of a garbage truck 3 floors below. He was not in his penthouse. He was not in any room he had ever been in before. He was lying on a couch, a real couch, the kind that had been broken in by years of actual use, covered by a thick patchwork blanket that smelled of lavender detergent. His jacket was gone. His shirt was gone. His ribs were wrapped in clean bandaging, slightly amateur but effective, and his phone, his watch, and his weapon were stacked neatly on a small wooden coffee table beside a glass of water and 2 aspirin. Someone had taken his gun and set it down like it was a set of car keys. Damian sat up slowly, reading the room the way he always read rooms. Tiny apartment, New York brownstone building, judging by the architecture visible through the curtains. One main room that served as living space and kitchen both, a short hallway to what he assumed was a bathroom, and a bedroom door barely ajar. Bookshelves on every wall, crammed full. A single framed photo on the kitchen counter. A woman and an older woman laughing at a picnic table, both dark-skinned, both beautiful. Plants on the windowsill. Coffee maker already running. And the smell, coffee and something warm, eggs maybe, and underneath it all the faint trace of vanilla, like a candle that had recently been blown out. It was the most lived-in space he had ever occupied. It felt nothing like danger. It felt like someone's whole life arranged on 30 square feet of intention. Footsteps. Light quick. The bedroom door swung open and she walked out. And Damian Voss, a man who had faced down federal prosecutors and rival bosses with equal stillness, went momentarily silent. She was in a white t-shirt and dark sweatpants, hair pulled back, holding a spatula and looking at him with the expression of someone who had not slept enough and was not in the mood for complications. No fear. That was the first thing he registered. Most people who woke up to find Damian Voss in their space produced fear immediately, the way a struck match produces light. This woman looked at him like he was a delayed delivery she had been waiting on since Tuesday. "You're up," she said. "Where am I?" he said. Not a question. A demand delivered at low volume, the way he always delivered demands. She didn't flinch. "My apartment." She turned back toward the kitchen. "Sit still. You lost a decent amount of blood. Who are you?" "The person who didn't leave you on the sidewalk." She cracked an egg into a pan with one hand. "Delilah Marsh. I'm a waitress, before you ask. Not a nurse. The urgent care clinic patched you up and said you'd be fine, but that you needed rest and fluids. And when I asked for your emergency contact, you were unconscious. And when I went through your pockets for ID," she paused, and something flickered across her face. "I found the kind of things that told me calling the regular police might not be the right move." Damian's eyes moved to the coffee table. His weapon was still there. She had left him his weapon. "So you brought me here. You were already in my car." She set a plate on the small kitchen table. "Eggs, toast, a sliced orange. Eat. Then you can make whatever calls you need to make and go back to wherever it is you came from." He studied her. "You're not afraid of me." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Should I be?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Damian Voss was a man who had built his entire power structure on the answer being yes. Men feared him. Women feared him. Entire organizations had restructured themselves around the geography of his displeasure. And this woman, 20-something, spatula in hand, standing in her cramped kitchen in a building where the radiator ticked and the walls were thin, was asking whether she had reason to be, as if it were a practical question with a practical answer. He said nothing. She nodded once, like he'd confirmed something. "Eat," she repeated, and she turned back to the stove. Damian reached for the glass of water first. His hands, which had never trembled, not once, in 17 years of violence and negotiation, were steadier than they should have been. Not because the danger had passed, but because something about the utter ordinariness of this room, this woman, this morning had done something to his nervous system that he didn't have language for yet. He picked up the aspirin, swallowed it, looked at the plate of food. He had not eaten a meal at a small kitchen table inn. He tried to remember and couldn't. He sat down at the table. Outside, New York was going about its business, indifferent and relentless as always. Inside, the coffee maker finished its cycle with a soft hiss, and Delilah Marsh poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of him. And for a long moment, there was no sound in the apartment except the city and the rain restarting softly against the window, and something that Damian couldn't name settling over the room like a held breath. He didn't know yet what this woman had just walked herself into. He didn't know that his enemies had already traced the ambush and were mapping the aftermath. He didn't know that by waking up in Delilah Marsh's apartment, he had just painted a target on the most ordinary, most carefully constructed life he had ever had the accidental privilege of intruding upon. He would know soon, and when he did, everything would change. Delilah had learned something growing up in D.C. that most people learn the hard way, if at all. The most dangerous thing you could do was ask a question you weren't ready to hear the answer to. So she didn't ask. She ate her breakfast across the table from the most quietly terrifying man she had ever been in a room with. And she did not ask who had shot him, or why, or who he was beyond the name she'd found on the single, elegant business card tucked inside his coat pocket. Damian Voss. Nothing else. No title, no number, just the name. And she did not ask about the second item she'd found, which was a folded document dense with numbers and foreign routing codes that she had immediately refolded and put back exactly where she'd found it. Some things he did not touch, but she watched him, that she allowed herself. He ate with the controlled precision of a man who treated every action as a transaction, efficient, deliberate, nothing wasted. He held the coffee mug in both hands, briefly, and she caught the flicker of something cross his face, something so small it barely registered, something like relief before the mask came back down. His eyes moved constantly, cataloging the apartment the way she cataloged a dining room when she walked into a shift. Exits, variables, the geometry of control. She had seen men like him before. Not in this city. Back home, before her mother died, and she'd gotten into the NYU scholarship and rebuilt herself from scratch. Men who occupied space differently than other men. Men whose stillness was a kind of violence. What she had not seen before was one of them eating eggs at her kitchen table, looking, underneath all that iron composure, like he hadn't slept well and longer than he could remember. "You should call someone," she said finally. "Let them know you're alive." He looked up. "You're not going to ask." "Ask what?" "What you found in my coat." She met his eyes steadily. "I told you. I found enough to know that calling the local precinct wasn't the smart move. Beyond that, it's not my business." She stood and carried her plate to the sink. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know that whoever you are, it's serious. But you're not bleeding anymore. You're not a threat to me, and you're going to leave." She turned on the tap. "So no, I'm not going to ask." The silence behind her lasted long enough that she turned back around. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't catalog. Not suspicion, not assessment. Something quieter than both. "Why?" he said. "Why what? Why didn't you leave me in the car?" Delilah dried her hands on the dish towel. Outside, a bus went by and rattled the window slightly, the way it did every morning. "Because you were bleeding and no one else was stopping." She shrugged, a small, precise motion. "That's all." "That's not all," he said. She didn't argue. He was right, and they both knew it. The full answer was longer and older and had more geography in it than she was going to give a stranger at 7 in the morning. It had her mother's face in it. It had a specific street corner in D.C. in it. It had the particular weight of being the kind of person who could not look away and live with herself afterward. "Make your call," she said. "Use my phone if yours is dead." He reached into the pocket of his folded coat and produced a sleek, dark phone and made a single call. He spoke in English, 3 sentences, low and precise. She caught the words, "Safe address, 1 hour." Then he ended the call and set the phone down. "They'll come for you in an hour," she said. "Yes. Then you can wait here." She picked up her bag from the hook by the door. "I have to go to the laundromat before my afternoon shift. Lock up when you leave." She paused, then added, because she was her mother's daughter and her mother had raised her with an instinct for the truth, "Whatever's happening out there, whoever did that to you, I hope it goes the way it needs to go." She said it like she meant it, because she did. She was halfway to the door when he spoke again. "Delilah." She stopped. The sound of her name in his voice was strange, not threatening, just unfamiliar in a way that landed with unexpected weight, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. "Thank you," he said, simply, like the words were new to him. She nodded once and left. She walked the 4 blocks to the laundromat in the thin November sun with her headphones in and her jaw set, telling herself that in 1 hour a black car would arrive at her building, the man with the iron eyes would get in it, and her life would go back to being exactly what it was: hard, hers, manageable. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that the moment she'd handed Damian Voss a cup of coffee and sat across from him in her small kitchen, she had become a thread in a story that was already moving around her, fast and silent and inevitable as a current. She didn't know that his enemies had already found her address. She didn't know that 2 men were watching her building from across the street. She didn't know that the hour she'd given him was already running out. She found out 40 minutes later when her phone rang, and it was him. "Don't go home," he said. "No preamble, no introduction." Just those 3 words, low and urgent. "Not yet. Where are you?" And something in his voice, not fear, he was not afraid, but something adjacent to it, something that sounded almost like the beginning of care, made her answer honestly instead of hanging up. He came to the laundromat. That was the part Delilah kept returning to later when she had the distance to think about it. Not that he'd called, not that he'd warned her, but that he had come himself, Damian Voss, in a fresh shirt one of his men had presumably brought, moving through the door of a coin laundromat in Lower Manhattan like he owned the square footage, which he probably could have, and he'd sat down on a plastic bench across from her folding table and looked at her with those still, dark eyes and said, "There are 2 men watching your building." "Because of you," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The dryers hummed. A woman at the far end was sorting whites. The fluorescent light above the change machine buzzed its single, endless note. "What do they want?" "To find out what you know, whether I said anything before I was found." He paused. "And to eliminate the possibility that you become a witness." The word eliminate sat between them like something dropped on the floor that neither of them wanted to pick up. Delilah set down the shirt she was folding. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the middle distance for exactly 4 seconds. She had learned to give herself 4 seconds, no more, before she had to move. And then she said, "So what do we do?" "Now what do I do?" "We." Something shifted in his face. The smallest fraction of movement around the eyes. "I'm going to have my men remove the threat," he said carefully. "You won't have to see it or know the details. But until it's done, you can't go back to that apartment. I have a property in Connecticut, a townhouse, secure, clean. You'd have your own floor. I have a shift at 4. He looked at her like she had said something in a language he was still learning. "Your shift. At the diner. Rosewood, on West 14th. I have tables at 4. She met his gaze. "I'm not disappearing into some townhouse in Connecticut because the consequences of your life followed you into my back seat. I have a job. I have regulars. I have rent due in 8 days. For the second time since he'd woken up in her apartment, Damian Voss was quiet in a way that felt different from his usual silences. His usual silences were tactical. This one was something else. Something that looked almost like someone recalibrating. 4 o'clock, he said finally. 4 o'clock. I'll have someone with you until this is resolved. One person. Plain clothes. They don't come into the diner. He studied her. You negotiate like you've done this before. I've worked double shifts for $11 an hour for 4 years, she said. I know how to negotiate. She picked up the shirt again and resumed folding. Sit down if you're going to stay. You're making the woman at the end nervous. He sat, and something almost unprecedented happened to the muscles around Damian Voss's mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the memory of one, something that had been put away for long enough that it barely knew what it was anymore. They sat in the laundromat for 40 minutes while his team handled the situation outside her building. She folded. He sat, and occasionally his eyes moved to the window with the alertness of someone who never fully stood down, but between those moments he looked at the floor or at his own hands or at the middle distance. He had the strange appearance of a man who had accidentally found rest in a place he hadn't been looking for it. She asked him once, only because the silence had gone on long enough that it had become a kind of honesty between them, what happened last night. Before my car. He was quiet for a moment. Ambush. Rival organization. It's been building for months. He paused. 2 of my men didn't make it. She heard it. The thing underneath the flat delivery of those words. The thing that men like him never said directly, because saying things directly meant feeling them, and feeling them meant vulnerability, and vulnerability in his world meant death. She heard it, and she didn't reach for it the way some people would have, didn't press or soften or try to fix it. She just let it be in the room, the way you let grief be in a room, because there was nowhere else for it to go. I'm sorry, she said. Simply. Completely. He looked at her. You mean that? Yes. Another silence. The dryer buzzed to a finish. She stood to retrieve the load. The people who did it, he said, won't be a problem for much longer. She didn't ask what that meant, but she said quietly, without looking at him, and after that, when the problem is resolved and your life goes back to what it is, what happens to the next set of problems? And the ones after that? She wasn't trying to reach him. She wasn't trying to change him. She was asking because it was the honest question underneath everything, and she had never been able to let honest questions go unasked. He didn't answer for a long time, long enough that she transferred the load and come back and sat down. I don't know, he said finally. The honesty of it, from a man who always knew, who had built his survival on always knowing, landed in the air between them like something rare and breakable. She nodded. Okay, she said. His phone vibrated. He read the screen. It's clear, he said. You can go home. She stood, gathered her bag, picked up the laundry basket. He stood too. And for a moment, they were just 2 people facing each other in the orange-white light of a laundromat while New York went about its November business outside. Thank you, she said, for calling. You would have walked into it. I know. She paused at the door. I'll be fine getting back. I know you will, he said. And the way he said it, not like a reassurance, but like a recognition, like he had seen something real and was naming it, made her pause with her hand on the door. She left without looking back, because looking back was something she had learned not to do. She didn't know he stood at that laundromat window and watched her until she turned the corner. She didn't know he stayed there for a full minute after she disappeared, which was 59 seconds longer than Damian Voss had stood still for any reason unrelated to strategy and longer than he could clearly remember. She didn't know. But she felt something on the back of her neck, something that felt like being seen, something warm in the cold November air. She walked faster. She told herself it was the wind. 3 days passed. Delilah went to work. She came home. She made dinner, read, slept, woke up, and did it again. The man from her back seat was gone. The plainclothes security person, a quiet woman named Carol who sat in a silver Hyundai outside the diner for 2 shifts and then wasn't there anymore, was gone. The 2 men who had been watching her building were presumably handled in whatever way men like Damian Voss handle things. Her life returned to its shape. And yet, there was a package left with her building's front desk on the second day. No card. Inside, 6 months of her rent, in a certified bank transfer made out in her name, and a burner phone with a single contact saved under the letter D. She stood in the lobby holding the envelope for a long time. She was not a woman who accepted things from men. She had a personal history with a particular kind of debt that came disguised as gifts. Her mother's boyfriend, 3 different situations in her early 20s, the slow tightening of obligation that people mistook for generosity. She knew what it felt like. She knew its weight and its aftertaste. This felt different, and she hated that it felt different because different was exactly what made it dangerous. She put the bank transfer in her drawer and did not deposit it. She kept the burner phone charged. On the 3rd night, after a double shift that left her standing at her kitchen counter too tired to make it to the couch, she looked at the spot where he'd sat at her table. She thought about the 4 seconds she'd given herself in the laundromat. She thought about how she'd said "we" instead of "I" and hadn't caught it until later. She thought about the way he'd said "thank you." Simply, like the words were new to him. She picked up the burner phone and typed, "The money is in a drawer. I'm not using it." She stared at the message for a moment. Then she added, "I wanted you to know I'm fine." She sent it before she could talk herself out of it. Then she went to bed. The response came at 11:47 p.m. She was almost asleep when the screen lit up. She reached for it with the automatic reflex of someone who had spent years being on call. It said, "I know you're fine. I've been making sure." She sat up. Her first instinct was indignation, the flare of it clean and fast. "You've been watching me." She was already composing the message, sharp and clear, when a second message arrived. It said, "Not watching. Checking. There's a difference. I'm aware you can handle yourself. I simply wanted to make sure the situation didn't reach you again." She stared at the screen. The radiator ticked. The city hummed its nighttime frequency below her window. She typed, "There's not much difference from where I'm standing." His response, "No, there isn't. I'm sorry." She read it twice. Then she put the phone face down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling, the bird-shaped water stain she'd been meaning to report to the building manager for 8 months. And she thought about the kind of man who apologized simply, without following it up with an explanation or a justification. She had not met many of those. She picked the phone back up. "Why are you texting me at midnight?" The pause before his response was long enough that she wondered if he'd gone to sleep. Then, "I couldn't sleep. I was passing through your neighborhood." She almost laughed. "Passing through." She typed, "Damian Voss passes through neighborhoods like mine." His response came fast this time. "I wanted to drive past. I don't have a better answer than that." She read it 3 times. Something about the honesty of it, the lack of excuse or architecture, the plain admission of something he couldn't justify, reached into the middle of her chest and pressed gently on something she had learned to keep very still. She got out of bed. She went to the window. The street below was mostly empty. 2 blocks south, a black car was idling at the curb, no lights on, perfectly still. She typed, "I can see your car." The response was immediate. "I know." She stood at the window in her t-shirt and socks. Below her, the black car didn't move. She could not see him from this angle. She could only see the car, parked and still in the amber streetlight, like a question she didn't know how to answer. She typed, "Come up if you're going to. I have leftover soup." She sent it before she could stop herself. She stood there with the phone in her hand and her heart doing something strange and rhythmic in her chest. The car door opened. She went to put the soup on. He knocked twice, quiet, the way a person knocks when they're aware it's late and the walls are thin and the world doesn't need to know their business. She opened the door, and he was standing there in a dark jacket, no tie, looking like a man who had driven to her block in the middle of the night and was only now fully registering the weight of that decision. "Soup," he said. "Soup," she confirmed. She stepped back. He came in. The apartment was the same apartment. The bookshelves, the plants, the photo of her and her mother. The table where he'd eaten eggs 3 days ago. He sat down in the same chair, and it occurred to Delilah, standing at the stove with a wooden spoon, that the last person to sit at that table regularly had been her mother on visits from D.C., and that she had not had someone sit there just to sit there in a very long time. She put the soup in front of him. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "I owe you more than rent," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "Delilah, I didn't help you because I wanted something back." She sat across from him. "I helped you because that's what you do." "People don't," he said. "Not in my experience." She met his eyes. "Then you've been around the wrong people." The silence that followed was the particular kind that accumulates meaning, that takes the air in a room and holds it, transformed, until something shifts. Outside, a siren passed 3 blocks over. Inside, the lamp made everything amber and close. "What happens now?" she asked. Not about the danger, not about the rivals or the machinery of his life. Just what happens now between 2 people sitting at a small table eating soup at midnight when they had no reason to be there except that they'd chosen to be. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I'd like to know you, if that's something you'd allow." Not a proposition, not a move, just the plain truth of what he wanted, offered up without strategy for the first time she'd witnessed, maybe for the first time in longer than he could account for. Delilah looked at him. The dangerous man with the quiet eyes who had eaten her eggs and sat in her laundromat and apologized without explanation and driven to her block at midnight because he couldn't sleep. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected that. I keep my life, my job, my apartment, my independence. Nobody watches me without my knowing." "Agreed. And you're honest with me. Not about everything. I understand there are things I shouldn't know. But when I ask you a direct question, I get a direct answer." He held her gaze. "That," he said quietly, "is the hardest one." "I know," she said. "That's why it's on a list." Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but its older cousin, the one that had seen more weather. He picked up the spoon. He ate the soup. And Delilah Marsh sat across from him in her small apartment and watched a man who had built his entire life on control and distance try, carefully, imperfectly, to sit still in someone else's warmth. This was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, the Voss syndicate's conflict with the Reyes organization reached its conclusion in a manner that the Manhattan financial press would later describe, without any useful specifics, as a significant restructuring of stakeholder interests. Damian did not share the details with Delilah. She did not ask. What he did tell her, at her kitchen table, on a Sunday morning, with coffee and the particular stillness of a city that had briefly lowered its volume, was that it was over and that the danger that had found her building, her car, her life, was gone. She nodded. She'd already known the way you know things when you've paid enough attention to the shape of someone's tension and can feel when it changes. "You can have your life back," he said. She looked at him. "Which part did I lose?" He paused. The question had edges he hadn't anticipated. The privacy of it. He stopped. "I came into your life uninvited, and I complicated things. What I'm saying is that the complication is resolved, and I wanted you to have the choice." "The choice," she repeated, "to return to what you had before. Without this." He gestured at the space between them, and it was, she thought, the most articulate vague gesture she had ever witnessed. This, which was 3 weeks of late-night texts and 2 more midnight soup visits and 1 afternoon where he'd come by unexpectedly to find her on the floor surrounded by overdue bills, and had sat down beside her, not touching, not fixing, just present, and they'd worked through the numbers together in the careful way of two people learning the edges of each other. She considered what he was offering, the easy return, the life she'd built and defended, brick by careful brick, against everything that had ever tried to reshape it without her consent. And then she said, "I don't want it back." He stilled, just slightly. "Not the whole version of it," she clarified. "I want my job. I want my apartment. I want the version of myself that doesn't need rescuing." She looked at him steadily. "But I don't want to go back to before you sat at this table. That part." She paused, because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had never wasted words. "That part I'd like to keep." The Sunday morning held its quiet around them. Damian set down his coffee. He looked at her with the eyes that had been cataloging her since the first morning he'd woken up in this apartment. Not with suspicion now, not with calculation, but with something that had been growing for weeks into a shape he recognized, finally, as what it was. Something that had been missing from his life. So long he had stopped knowing what the absence felt like. Something that felt, in this moment, in this small apartment with the bookshelves and the plants and the bird-shaped water stain, like a rival. "There are things about my life," he said carefully, "that you would find difficult. There are things about mine you'd find difficult. I make $14 an hour, and I have strong opinions about dishwashing." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking for honest. And if honest means that I'm still the man you found bleeding in your back seat, that I don't become something safer." "I didn't fall for something safer," she said, quietly, clearly. The first time she'd used that word between them, and she felt it land in the room with all its weight. "I fell for you sitting in a laundromat when you didn't have to. For you apologizing at midnight because you were honest enough to know you'd overstepped. For you sitting on my floor next to a pile of bills without turning it into a reason to pay them for me." She folded her hands around her mug. "That's who I fell for. Whatever else you are, I'll learn it. I'm a fast learner." Damian Voss, who had negotiated the terms of things that would never see a courtroom, who had sat across from men who wanted him dead and given nothing away, looked at Delilah Marsh across a kitchen table in a 30-square-foot apartment and felt the ground of himself shift into something more solid than it had been in years. "Delilah," he said, "Damian, I would like to take you to dinner." He paused. "A real dinner. Not soup at midnight." She almost smiled. "That depends. Where?" "Wherever you want." She thought about it. "There's a Jamaican place on 131st in Harlem. Best Oxdale in New York. Cash only, 10 tables. The owner is named Miss Vera, and she will make you uncomfortable if you don't finish your plate." Something happened to his face then. The full version of what had been trying to happen since the laundromat, what had been building through every conversation and silence and midnight message. A smile. Real, unguarded, unarchitected. The smile of a man who had forgotten he owned one. "I'll finish my plate," he said. She nodded, satisfied. She stood to clear the cups. He stood too, and for a moment they occupied the small kitchen simultaneously, and it was very close, and neither of them moved to make it less close. "For the record," he said, low, near her ear, "I've never gotten into the wrong car before." She turned her head. He was right there. "Is that what it was?" she asked. "Wrong." His eyes found hers. "No," he said. "I don't think it was." She let that sit. She let it fill the room. Let it settle into the bookshelves and the plants and the thin curtains and the water stain on the ceiling. She let it be what it was, the beginning of something that had already changed them both, quietly, without permission, the way the most important things always happen. "Sunday," she said. "Dinner. 7 o'clock. You're picking me up and you're parking your own car. No driver." "Done." "And Damian," she turned to face him fully, "if you're ever bleeding in a back seat again, Call someone before you pass out." He looked at her. "I'll try," he said, "but I can't promise I won't make the same mistake." She studied him, and this time she let herself smile, wide and real and unhidden, the smile that people who'd known her for years said was the thing about Delilah Marsh you remembered after everything else faded. "It wasn't a mistake," she said. Outside, New York went on being New York, relentless, indifferent loud. But in the small apartment on the third floor, with the coffee gone cold and the Sunday light cutting clean through the thin curtains, two people stood in a kitchen that had become, over 3 weeks of improbable mornings, the most important place either of them had ever accidentally ended up. Some doors you don't open, some cars you don't get into, some lives you protect by keeping the walls up and the distances clear and the variables controlled. And some nights the rain comes down and something happens that can't be explained by strategy or intention or anything other than the plain, unearned grace of being in the right place at exactly the right moment. Damian Voss had spent 41 years surviving. He had not, until a November night in New York and a woman with a spatula and 4 seconds of silence and soup at midnight understood the difference between surviving and being alive. He understood it now, and somewhere in the amber light of that small, full, carefully built apartment, so did she. Thank you so much for watching this story. If this moved you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. The next episode is coming, and you're not going to want to miss what happens when Damian's past walks through Delilah's door, and she doesn't blink.